The January fog of 1888 did not merely drift. It clung, a wet, suffocating presence that turned the lamps of the lower docks into sickly, amber orbs. It muffled the clamor of the city, replacing the usual roar of commerce with a hushed, nervous drip. This was the kind of night when even the sturdiest brick buildings seemed to shrink, their edges softening into the gray void. No one liked a fog like this. It bred accidents, concealed criminals, and, worst of all, fed the city's ancient anxieties. Engine Company No. 4 was playing a dull hand of cards when the alarm bell shrieked its 3 sharp, insistent pulses. Instantly, the oppressive quiet of the night was shattered by the controlled chaos of men, moving with practiced urgency. The address was Blackwood and Cypress, a notorious tenement district known for its dense packing and ramshackle internal construction, a perfect tinderbox. Within 60 seconds, the steam engine was hissing, the horses were churning the slick cobblestones, and the crew was mounted, peering into the swirling mist. The ride was a harrowing blind rush. Inspector Thomas Albright, watching from his nearby beat, saw the engine tear past, its lantern throwing defiant streaks of light against the oppressive atmosphere. He noted the chilling effect of the fog on the sound. The engine's frantic bell seemed to die prematurely, as if swallowed whole just 50 feet from the source. The air itself felt heavy, expectant, like a theater before a final, terrible act. Everyone knew that a fire starting on a night like this rarely ended well. The fog had provided the perfect curtain for disaster to draw close. Captain Silas Thorne was a giant of a man, not just in stature, but in the unwavering respect he commanded. He had been a fireman for 30 years. He knew every alley, every draft, every hidden weak point of the dockside buildings. His crew was a tight, formidable unit. Daniel "Danny" Kincaid, the young, quick-witted nozzleman, often first up the ladder. Patrick O'Malley, the burly, reliable plugman, ensuring the water supply held, and the inseparable brothers Elias and Jonah Finch, who specialized in ladder work and rescue. As they pulled up to the tenement, the fire was already roaring through the 3rd and 4th floors. The flames were not bright. They were a dull, sickly orange, choked by the wet atmosphere, yet they consumed the interior with terrifying speed. Thorne took one look at the narrow street and the dense smoke pouring from the windows and knew they had to be fast. "O'Malley, get that plug. Kincaid, you're on the high window. Elias, Jonah, you're the backbone. Secure that ladder." The iconic photograph, taken by a pressman who risked life and lens, freezes this precise moment. Danny Kincaid, hose braced, ascends the single precarious ladder into the mouth of the blaze. Thorne stands below, his face grim but resolute, his hand clamped firmly on the heavy hose, feeding his nozzleman to the heat. The Finch brothers anchor the base, their backs straining against the ladder's weight. There was no hesitation in their movements, only the fierce, desperate poetry of men confronting destruction. What the lens could not capture was the unnatural quality of the smoke itself. It didn't lift, it pressed down, thick and acrid, and smelled not just of wood and coal, but of something metallic and faintly sweet, like burnt incense or decayed spices. As Kincaid reached the top window, prepared to unleash the torrent, the crowd below held its breath. This was the moment of attack, the point where human resolve met brute force. It was the last valiant act before the silence on Cypress Street began. The entire scene, the roaring fire, the churning hose, the ascending hero, was suspended in the thick, wet air. Then, the attack began. Danny Kincaid braced himself at the shattered window frame, ready to direct the high-pressure stream into the inferno's heart. But the blast of water never came. First, there was a sound the crowd would never forget. Not the hiss of the steam, nor the crack of burning timber, but a sharp, clean snap that cut through the cacophony. It was the sound of the thick, canvas-wrapped hose line, the very lifeblood of the operation, grasped by Captain Thorne, being severed with impossible precision. The jet of water, which had been a vibrant, solid pillar seconds before, simply vanished. It didn't fizzle or sputter. It ceased entirely, as if an invisible valve had been closed instantly on a stream hundreds of yards away. An unnatural, absolute silence descended upon Cypress Street. The onlookers, their faces reflecting the terrified, amber glow of the fire, watched the 3 men at the base of the ladder, Thorne and the Finch brothers, stumble. They weren't reacting to a loss of pressure, but to the loss of tension. The heavy hose in their hands had gone suddenly limp and cold. Then came the terrible, final sight, the smoke. It had been chaotic, billowing. Now, it seemed to coalesce. The dense, metallic-scented vapor from the fourth-floor window didn't lift into the sky. It surged outward and then downward like a collapsing, inverted curtain. It seemed to envelop Kincaid on the ladder, and the portion of the wall he was next to. When the smoke finally dispersed, an action that took only a few rapid, terrifying seconds, the ladder remained. The nozzleman, Danny Kincaid, did not. The fire still raged, but the 5 firemen, Thorne, Kincaid, O'Malley at the distant plug, and the Finch brothers at the base, were gone. All that remained on the slick cobblestones was the cleanly cut, dripping end of the hose, a grim and utterly baffling exhibit of unmaking. The arrival of a second engine company eventually brought the raging fire under control, but the true cold on Cypress Street was not the damp January air. It was the chilling, inexplicable absence of the 5 men. The systematic search began immediately, turning the charred tenement into a skeletal landscape. They clawed through the sodden debris, overturning beams and sifting through mountains of wet ash. Fire chiefs, veterans of scores of blazes, were confronted with a baffling paradox. A fire hot enough to melt glass and warp iron had left no trace of flesh or bone. There were no discernible remains, no buttons from a coat, no melted brass from a helmet, nothing that even hinted at their previous existence. A body consumed entirely by fire leaves a mark, calcined bone fragments, distinct ash, a clear point of impact. This site was cleanly, horribly empty. The only evidence of the company's presence was the abandoned hose plugged down the street, and the clean, peculiar cut on the hose line resting on the cobblestones. The cut was the focus of immediate, hushed speculation. It was too straight, too precise to be the work of a collapsing beam or a burst boiler. It looked like a deliberate amputation. The official report, written under immense pressure to provide certainty to a stunned public, ultimately settled on the vague and terrifying phrase, "consumed by the inferno." But this lie satisfied no one, least of all the grizzled captains who toured the site. They knew what fire did to a man. This was something other than fire. This was an erasure, and it sat heavily on the conscience of the city, a cold spot in the heart of a disaster. The missing men had not just died, they had been unmade. Inspector Thomas Albright was a man of cold logic and colder coffee. He had seen enough horror in his tenure at the city's central precinct to be immune to sensationalism, but the case of the 5 missing firemen burrowed into him like a splinter. He was assigned the file only to stamp the findings and placate the public, yet the official verdict, "consumed by the inferno," felt like a sick joke printed on official stationery. Albright toured the site 3 days later, long after the crowds had dispersed and the department had cleared the major debris. He ignored the soot-stained walls and focused on the cobblestones. The distinct cut on the hose line, now secured in an evidence locker, was his obsession. No ordinary failure of equipment could achieve such a precise, surgical separation. If the firemen were utterly consumed, why was their vital lifeline severed so cleanly? He spoke to the witnesses, not about the fire, but about the silence. Every account was identical, the sudden, deep stillness that followed the snap. It was like the whole world stopped breathing, one shopkeeper confessed, his eyes wide with remembered terror. Albright concluded that the men hadn't been defeated by the fire. They had been interrupted. Something had occurred in the gap between the jet of water stopping and the smoke surging. It was a detail too clean, too deliberate for the chaotic nature of a blaze. He sat late in his office, the file open, the fire chief's signature mocked by his own pencil markings. He realized he wasn't looking for a disaster's explanation, he was looking for a crime's perpetrator. A perpetrator who utilized fire, not as a weapon of destruction, but as a veil of disappearance. Inspector Albright recognized that the missing men would not be found in the ashes. The secret lay in the building itself. The tenement at Blackwood and Cypress had been primarily residential, housing dockworkers and transient laborers, but Albright's detailed review of the rent rolls showed the fourth-floor apartment, the source of the severing smoke, had been rented for only 2 months by a man listed simply as Mr. V. Karras. The rent had been paid in gold, in advance. Albright secured permission to spend an afternoon in the ruins of the fourth floor, now a skeletal shell open to the cold air. He didn't search for bodies, he searched for anomaly. He sifted through the floorboards where Danny Kincaid had been standing and, near the shattered window frame, he found a section of the subfloor that had been hastily covered by a cheap, thin rug. The wood beneath was unburned. Prying it loose, Albright found what he had truly been looking for, something entirely separate from the fire. Scratched deeply into the timber, beneath a thin layer of protective varnish, was a complex, unsettling symbol. It was not graffiti. It was not a superstition. It was a geometric arrangement of overlapping triangles that seemed to absorb the light, centered around a small, blackened, perfectly circular depression. The mark spoke of deliberate, careful ritual, wholly out of place in a working-class tenement. Albright felt a distinct chill, colder than the January air. This was no ordinary arson or accident. The symbol was the signature of a purpose, a grim prelude to the disappearance. The fire had been a diversion, the tenants were a cover. Mr. V. Karras had rented the spot where the fire would be focused, and where 5 lives would be sacrificed to the inexplicable pattern etched into the floor. Albright's logical mind demanded a conventional explanation. Smugglers, perhaps, or a deadly new form of explosive. But the sigil on the floorboards defied standard police work. With a heavy sigh, he filed the crime scene photos of the mark under unusual contrivances, and sought out the one man in the city who tolerated, and perhaps even cherished, the obscure. Professor Alastair Finch, no relation to the missing fireman, a retired academic and amateur historian of the city's darker corners. Finch's study smelled of old leather and ozone. The moment Albright showed him the photograph of the geometric mark, the professor's demeanor shifted from genial eccentricity to cold concern. He adjusted his spectacles, tracing the pattern with a shaky finger. "This, Inspector, is not a contrivance. It is a key. A key to what they called the Blackwood Society." The professor explained that the society was not a conventional club. Active in the city from the mid-19th century, they were a closed circle of wealthy, educated elites obsessed with unorthodox metaphysics, specifically, the manipulation of matter and energy through ritual. Their goal was supposedly to achieve a perfect, instantaneous transformation, or unmaking, bypassing the slow decay of nature. They had been rumored to use the dockside tenements for their most clandestine meetings, viewing the transient lives there as expendable cover. "They needed a place of focused chaos, Inspector," Finch whispered, leaning closer. "A crucible. The fire wasn't meant to destroy evidence, it was meant to power the ritual. The unmaking requires immense, sudden energy, and the complete disruption of life. And 5 men, swallowed by a collapsing column of smoke, that is the signature of their horrifying success." Albright felt the skepticism he prized crumble away. He wasn't chasing a common criminal, he was hunting a shadow organization that used the very fabric of reality as its weapon. Professor Finch pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from his shelf, a privately printed text too fragile for the university library. Its pages detailed the chilling doctrines of the Blackwood Society. They weren't merely spiritualists, Inspector. They were metaphysical engineers, Finch explained, his voice low and serious. The professor opened the book to a terrifying diagram, remarkably similar to the mark found on the tenement floor. This ritual, he confirmed, was the ritual of the unmaking. Its purpose was not conventional death, but the complete, instantaneous erasure of matter and memory. The society believed that life and history left an imprint on the world, and by harnessing immense, chaotic energy, such as a fast-moving, destructive fire, they could force this imprint into a state of non-existence. "The chaos of the fire served 2 purposes," Finch continued. "First, the heat and confusion provided the necessary energy surge to momentarily tear the fabric of reality at that specific point, the focus of the sigil. Second, the disruption, the noise, the smoke, the urgency, acted as a shield, ensuring the sacrifice would be unnoticed, chalked up to disaster. The firemen, tragically, were the perfect components. They were men of powerful vitality, directly engaging the chaotic core of the blaze. They were at the exact point of the ritual's focus. The cleanly severed hose was the horrifying proof. It signified the moment the ritual succeeded, the point where the physical connection between the firemen and the ordinary world was snapped clean, allowing them to be pulled through the momentary tear and into absolute nothingness. They didn't burn, Inspector, Finch concluded, closing the morbid text. They were simply deleted. And the society needed that power for something far greater than 5 lives. The next step in Albright's unorthodox investigation led him to the small, grieving home of Captain Thorne's widow, Eleanor. She was fragile but fiercely composed, determined to reclaim her husband's memory from the disgrace of the unsolved disappearance. Albright found no answers in her tearful recollections of a good, simple man. However, while packing away her husband's effects, Eleanor presented the inspector with a small, leather-bound book. Not a ledger or a diary, but a captain's observation log. Thorne used it to jot down unusual street occurrences, odd smells, and recurring faces in his district. The entries from the 2 weeks leading up to the fire were strangely obsessive, centered entirely on the tenement at Blackwood and Cypress. Thorne hadn't been focused on the building's structural flaws, but on its visitors. January 4th. 2 men, well-dressed, but with dust on their boots, left Cypress Side at 3 a.m. Carried a long, narrow trunk. Too large for luggage. January 8th. Observed a repeating scent of burnt laurel and copper near the 4th-floor alley window. No fire visible. Unsettling. January 11th. The tenant, Karras, never shows his face. But the delivery boy reports strange, metallic sounds from his room, not construction. Like hollow ringing. The final entry, dated the day before the blaze, was written in a hurried, almost panicked scrawl. The atmosphere around that block is wrong. It doesn't feel like the city. The fog today, it was waiting. If a fire starts there, it won't be an accident. It will be an invitation. This notebook confirmed Albright's worst fears. Thorne hadn't been an unwitting victim. He had been an unaware observer of the preparations. He had seen the comings and goings of the Blackwood Society, noting the metallic and organic precursors to their ritual. His crew hadn't stumbled into a tragedy, they had charged directly into a carefully laid trap. Thorne's frantic final notes, particularly the mention of metallic sounds and the mysterious Mr. Karras, guided Albright back to Professor Finch. The professor, after cross-referencing old city ledgers and property transfers, identified a reclusive clockmaker named Jeremiah Croft who had done specialized work for several prominent, now-deceased members of the original Blackwood Society. Croft's workshop was located discreetly just 3 blocks from the burnt tenement. Croft was an ancient, stooped man whose tiny shop was a museum of intricate mechanisms and ticking silence. Confronted with the sigil and Thorne's notebook, Croft's face crumpled. He admitted he was an estranged former artisan for the society, forced into years of silence by threats. He confirmed that Karras was merely a figurehead, and the fire was indeed a ritual. Croft revealed that the society's most recent, most dangerous ambition was to anchor the unmaking power to a physical focus. This focus was the obsidian shard, a crystalline object of immense density and purported cosmic origin, which the society believed could store and direct the ritualistic energy. Karras hired me not to make a clock, Inspector, Croft confessed, his voice a dry rasp, but to build a resonator. A metallic device to hold the shard and amplify the ritual's energy precisely at the 4th-floor window. The sounds Thorne heard, that was the resonator being tuned. They didn't just want to disappear those men, they needed their energy to charge the shard for something greater. The terrifying truth dawned on Albright. The 5 firemen were not just collateral damage. They were the fuel. Their sacrifice, catalyzed by the fire's chaos and focused by the resonator and the sigil, was intended to fully activate the shard, creating a devastating weapon of erasure now loose in the city. Albright, now convinced he was tracking an occult conspiracy rather than a police case, returned to the ruin with Professor Finch. Albright was searching for physical residue. Finch was searching for metaphysical residue. Armed with a cumbersome electrometer, a device usually used for studying atmospheric electricity but calibrated by Finch to detect unusual energy fluctuations, they focused on the precise area on the cobblestones where the hose had been severed. The fire had been out for days, the air chilled and damp, but the needle on Finch's fragile instrument began to quiver violently. It wasn't reacting to heat or common static. It was registering a negative, concentrated spike right where the cut hose had lain. "Observe, Inspector," Finch murmured, pointing a gloved finger at the ground. "Ordinary fire leaves behind chaos, entropy. This spot is defined by an unnatural organization, a perfect vacuum of energy. It is the signature of the unmaking ritual, the point where the life force of those 5 men was brutally extracted and anchored to the shard." As they spoke, a thin, acrid vapor, not smoke but a cold metallic mist, seemed to rise briefly from the exact point of the spike before dissipating. Albright, a man who believed only in evidence he could catalogue, felt a primal recoil. The sensation was not one of heat, but of absolute chill, a feeling of being near a place where something essential had been permanently subtracted from the world. The evidence was undeniable. This corner of Cypress Street was cursed. The power used in the ritual was still clinging to the stones, a faint, toxic echo of the moment 5 men were pulled through the world's seam. The firemen hadn't merely burned, they had been expended, their very existence converted into dark, concentrated power. The realization that the obsidian shard was now charged and likely in the possession of the Blackwood Society's current leadership spurred Albright into a frantic investigation of the city's upper echelon. Professor Finch, using his deep knowledge of historical connections, cross-referenced the property owners of the Blackwood and Cypress tenement with known associates or descendants of the Society's founders. The result was a name that made Albright's blood run cold: Senator Alastair Vance. Vance was a man of impeccable reputation, a pillar of commerce and political power, and a public voice of moral rectitude, the perfect, untouchable facade. Vance was the great-grandson of the Society's most fervent early leader and had recently bought the tenement through a shell company 6 months prior. Around the same time, Mr. V. Karras signed the lease. "The old guard merely sought knowledge, Inspector," Finch explained grimly. "But Vance wants absolute power. The obsidian shard, fully charged by the collective life force of 5 men, can be used to erase debts, rivals, or even entire historical documents. He can unmake inconvenient truths." Albright realized the magnitude of the conspiracy. Vance hadn't simply used the ritual to hide his activities. He had used the firemen's erasure as a spectacular demonstration of the shard's power, testing the ritual's limits for a far grander, more sinister purpose. Vance wasn't interested in secrets, he was interested in rewriting reality through occult force, starting with the very foundation of the city. The vanishing of Captain Thorne and his men was merely the first, catastrophic proof that his weapon worked. Albright knew that simply apprehending Vance and recovering the shard might not provide closure for the missing men. He needed to understand where they had gone. Desperate, he returned to Professor Finch, who reluctantly suggested a risky, ancient method of clairvoyance, a forced contact with the residual trauma energy at the ritual site. Finch led Albright back to the tenement ruins late one moonless night. He set up a small, obsidian mirror taken from his collection and burned specific herbs over the spot of the unnatural energy spike. He instructed Albright to place his hand on the cold, marked cobblestone and focus his entire mind on the moment of the snap. What followed was not a vision, but an intense, sickening sensory overload. Albright's ears filled with the roaring heat of the blaze, the panicked cries of the crowd, and, overriding it all, a sound like a great metal door slamming shut on the world. He felt the crushing weight of the smoke. Not just hot vapor, but a palpable, physical density, pressing down. In a terrifying flash, he saw Danny Kincaid on the ladder. Kincaid wasn't looking at the fire. His eyes were wide, fixed on a spot behind the flames, a swirling, perfect blackness that was colder than space. Albright didn't see the firemen step off the ladder, he saw them being sucked. Their figures distorted momentarily, stretching like shadows on a curtain, before the blackness snapped closed. Kincaid's final expression was not pain, but overwhelming, silent awe. Albright tore his hand away, gasping for breath, the scent of metallic sweetness clinging to his nostrils. "They were pulled," he rasped, confirming the worst. "It wasn't a burning. It was a void. They were yanked right out of our reality." The professor nodded solemnly. The memory of the event was trapped in the residual energy, a terrifying echo proving that the Blackwood Society's ritual of the unmaking had worked with devastating, absolute efficiency. Thorne's notebook had provided the final, necessary piece of evidence. An entry detailing a recent expansion of Senator Vance's downtown bank vault mentioned specialized fire suppression conduits and non-conductive stone being installed. For Albright, it wasn't about security, it was about ritualistic isolation. The vault was the perfect containment unit for the volatile obsidian shard. Albright secured a highly risky, secret warrant and, with a small, trusted team, breached the vault late that night. They found Vance alone, sitting calmly before a heavy, black pedestal. Resting upon it was the shard, a crystalline piece of midnight, about the size of a fist, that seemed to drink the light. It hummed with a low, barely audible frequency, a sinister thrum of concentrated, unmade energy. Vance didn't flee, he smiled. Inspector Albright. You are a day late. The shard is fully charged. I can erase my father's failed investments, the record of this entire investigation, perhaps even the memory of those 5 pesky firemen from the city's mind. His voice was utterly devoid of remorse. Albright ignored the threat and moved toward the pedestal. As he did, he saw something else. Draped across the base, where the shard's dark power emanated, was a brass buckle, heavy, scarred, and unmistakably belonging to the belt of Captain Silas Thorne. It was a trophy, a grotesque souvenir of the unmaking. You took their existence, Albright snarled, grabbing the buckle. And you left their ghost. The ensuing struggle was brief. Vance, weakened by his recent ritualistic endeavors, was subdued. But as Albright's team secured the shard, the inspector looked down at Thorne's buckle. It was cold, strangely light, and felt hollow, a remnant from a life violently excised. The confrontation was won, but the heroes remained lost, their last physical anchor a trophy on a villain's altar. Senator Vance was swiftly arrested, his reputation incinerated by the evidence linking him to the Blackwood Society and the occult ritual. The obsidian shard was secured by military authorities, not destroyed, but sealed away in a deep vault, its dreadful unnatural energy contained but not dissipated. The official explanation for the firemen's disappearance was finally revised to a vague, catastrophic and unusual structural collapse, a lie less digestible than the first, but necessary to prevent panic. Albright, holding Captain Thorne's brass belt buckle, knew the true cost. He had stopped a madman from wielding absolute power, but he had failed to bring his heroes home. The ritual of the unmaking had not been defeated, it had simply worked. Weeks later, the ruins of the tenement were finally razed. As the last walls came down, Albright stood on Cypress Street, now empty of spectators, and felt the persistent coldness emanating from the cobblestones. The city tried to forget, to pave over the memory, but the tragedy was now part of the city's dark, whispered history. He gave the buckle to Eleanor Thorne, telling her only that it was found near the site of the most intense heat. He did not tell her it was found on a murderer's altar. The 5 firemen, Thorne, Kincaid, O'Malley, and the Finch brothers, were never declared dead, only missing in action. They remained frozen in that terrible moment, ascending the ladder, their lives converted into a toxic, terrifying form of energy. Albright realized that the absence was their most enduring legacy. They didn't leave a ghost or a body to mourn, they left a void in the city's soul. And sometimes, when the thick, wet fog rolled in from the harbor, people swore they could smell not coal smoke, but a faint, metallic sweetness, the lingering scent of the terrible, clean erasure of 1888.